Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Joseph Banks, Assistant Director for Career Services and the Dedicated Career Coach for the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And welcome to the Alumni Lunch Series Digital Takeout. Great opportunity that we have here for our USU alums to talk about their experience and discuss different opportunities that await many of our CHaSS students. So before we begin, I just want to let everyone know that if you have any questions for the speaker, feel free to use the question and answer feature. And we have London here monitoring those questions to ask after the first part of our discussion. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Andrea to introduce our guest today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. I'm so excited to be welcoming Katie Miner back, even though it's via the virtual universe, but she is a recent graduate and someone that I had the pleasure of working with, and I'm really excited to get the opportunity to talk to her today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Katie before turning the time over to her. Katie Miner served as the Deputy Campaign Manager and Finance Specialist for Spencer Cox's record-breaking and ultimately successful campaign for governor. I should mention that Spencer Cox is also an alum of CHaSS. The campaign maintained a strong orientation towards service and grassroots efforts despite untraditional challenges. After the campaign, she worked on the first inauguration held in rural Utah, and now she is tackling a new role as the Utah Governor's Office of Management and Budget's latest analyst hire. Katie has a not so small obsession with art and spent pre-academic free time hunting galleries. These days, she can also be found masked and rock climbing or reading while drinking a Diet Coke. In May 2020, Katie graduated from Utah State University with a major in political science and minors in art history and anticipatory intelligence. During her time at Utah State, she completed 2 internships during Utah State legislative sessions and 3 internships with various political groups in Washington, D.C. And I am just so excited to welcome our alum, Katie Miner, to the digital takeout today. And Katie, I'm going to start with the first question for you, which is just to have you briefly tell us a little bit about your history and how you came to your current position, and remind us how you chose sort of your interest in politics and what you like about your job and how you keep up with the industry.
Thanks, Andrea. I am really excited to be back, although it kind of feels like there was no reason for me to leave since there was no graduation and it was a pandemic and I was busy running a campaign and doing all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of a weird experience to be called a graduate of Utah State. Haven't had to think about that much yet. But like Andrea said, I just spent the last little while working on Spencer Cox's campaign and had a really great experience. But obviously you have to get to that point. So at some point, and everyone always asks me how I got my start in politics, and I don't really have a great answer. But the more I think about it, I was raised by parents and grandparents who taught me a love of country and a love of helping others. And I think that that's kind of what I've always been interested in, is that you have to do something to give back, and you have to do something to help. And this is how I've been able to help the most. And so it's been kind of fun to tackle a problem in our community and figure out how best to solve it. So I guess my little journey started out, I've only been graduated for a year, so I have to go back pretty far. But as a senior in high school, I wanted to go to Georgetown, and this is where I thought I would end up. But like all of us, I ended up here in quite possibly an even more beautiful spot. And while I didn't know it at the time, it definitely ended up being the best place for me. And it's been really awesome for my career so far. After my freshman year at Utah State, I did an internship with the IOGP in Washington, D.C. Just because I knew that I liked DC and I didn't want to be in Logan in the summer, and I needed something to do. And so this seemed like a good fit. It was with a firm that was doing something that I wasn't particularly interested in, other than that they were in the political sphere. But I figured I would try it out, and I ended up loving it. I had a crazy summer. I learned that I'm definitely a work 100-hour weeks type of person rather than a 9-to-5 type of person. I loved being a couple of metro stops away from friends, but in a new city by myself. I had incredible mentors. I had incredible bosses while I was there. And I learned a lot about how the political sphere works from a very different perspective than anything I had ever been a part of. I ended up returning to that same internship with my political consulting firm the next year. And had a myriad of really interesting experiences. My firm was not the official side of things. It was campaigns, but from a fundraising perspective. So it was kind of fun. The first day that Senator Hatch remembered my name, he was just one of our clients, but the first day that he remembered my name, I was at an event with some other interns that night, and one of the interns in Senator Hatch's office said, I met Senator Hatch for the first time, and he shook my hand. And I was excited that he had remembered my name for the first time on our 8th meeting. So kind of fun experiences in a really different perspective. And some of it was glamorous and some of it was less glamorous, as you can see. But I ended up returning to school. I did a couple of internships at the state legislature. I got a couple of stress-related eye infections on election nights. And that's just how it goes, and it was fun. But I kept myself busy. We started clubs and all sorts of stuff before I went back to DC in 2019 for a last summer with a championship team win against Senator Romney's team. I rounded out my DC experience. And then came back to Utah for by far the strangest campaign I'd ever been a part of. And I'd never really been the person on the ground in a campaign. I'd always been in DC helping fundraise for candidates who were running campaigns all across the country. But even that notwithstanding, this was the strangest campaign I'd ever seen. And a little bit of background on that, in 2019, the lieutenant governor wrote an article about Mitt Romney's campaign for president. And he and his friend worked on the campaign, and the campaign spent over $1 billion, and that's billion with a B. It's massive amounts of money. At the end of the day, the governor always says that he asked his friend, do you believe the country is a better place at the end of the campaign than at the beginning? And the answer was a resounding no. And I think in 2016, we can all remember that answer was a resounding no again, that the hate and the divisiveness that campaigns bring out, we're not making the campaign a better place. And we can see that the numbers of it just got worse. You can see that the total Republican spending in 2012, and you shouldn't cite my numbers on this for anything because I pulled them from 7 different sources and it's not that scientific, but I'm learning how to be a better budget person these days. But you can see that the total Republican spending was over $2 billion in 2012. And that number has continued to skyrocket to almost $8 billion spent by Democratic candidates in this most recent 2020 cycle. And is that money getting us more focused debates? Is it getting us better candidates? Is spending almost $8 billion getting us more sustainable communities? Is it making the lives of our citizens better? I would probably argue no. And this is Governor Cox's response. Is it possible to run a campaign that win or lose would make our state a better place? I believe that Utah's different. I believe that Utah's special. In Utah, we lead the nation in volunteer service and charitable giving every year. If it can be done anywhere, it can be done in Utah, and I am willing to lose trying. And so with that as our little mantra, in August of 2019, we set out to do it. Our campaign was really small. It was only 3 to 4 full-time staff. We were insanely outspent, about 10 to 1 ahead of the June 30th primary. So we had to innovate, and we visited all 248 cities and towns, and we did service projects along the way. We raised money for charity instead of for the campaign at some points. We were endorsed by more than 150 mayors throughout the course of the campaign. We gathered signatures with an entirely volunteer effort, which had never been done for a statewide campaign before. We never ran a negative ad, and the governor would have murdered us all if we had tried. So one of the questions that I'm supposed to answer is, how do you keep up with your industry? And I don't really have a good answer to that, except for I was listening to NPR at some point during right before the November 3rd election, and they were telling a story about the beginning scene in HBO's The Watchmen, which I haven't seen yet because I was running a campaign during. It's kind of like returning from a period of religious service where everyone asks you if you've seen something that happened in the past 2 years and you have no idea what they're talking about because all you did was sit in an office and work. But about this opening scene where it starts to rain squids and the mom's in the car with her daughter and she pulls over and waits for the squids to stop and then she just keeps going. And about how as humans, we can learn to deal with some really odd things and we can learn to deal with some really odd environments. And that's kind of what being in a campaign is like. And everyone has gotten a little taste of this with the pandemic. But that's just kind of what it is. You're presented with a problem. Circumstances are insane. Someone says something that's insanely untrue, and you just do it. And sometimes you do graphic design projects at 5 a.m. And sometimes that means that you're scrapping multi-million-dollar fundraising plans because a global pandemic hits and it's time to serve neighbors instead of donate to political campaigns, but you still have to win anyway. So all sorts of types of things. I just barely started a new job, and I'm learning an entirely new set of squid rain, unprecedented circumstances. And I'm really loving that opportunity to learn a little bit more about a new set of things to do. So happy to answer any questions.
Great, Katie. Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks for sharing your history there. Just a few of the questions that we have. One, just looking at the current political environment, you kind of alluded to it there, Katie, but, I think, one of the main effects that has happened is that people have either gotten really interested in politics or people have really just dissuaded, have turned away from politics in general. For yourself, how do you kind of stay above the fray of, the political backbiting and stuff, but also remain so invested and interested in politics?
That's a really good question. And it kind of has a complicated answer. I mean, it's always tempting to ignore things that are difficult, right? It's always tempted to look the other way. I just saw that Professor Johnson is on the call, and think about all of the challenging circumstances that Professor Johnson has run up against and pushed through them anyway, and our country's safer for it. One thing that I've learned in politics in particular is that with public policy, there's rarely a right and a wrong answer that's so clear. I worked for a state senator who frequently said that there's a million great solutions for a problem that will never work. And so sometimes it takes a little bit of trial and error, and sometimes it takes finding a balance. There's very few people who are not interested in doing the right thing. Some of them are more seriously misguided than others, and some of them we disagree with more than we disagree with others. But in general, most people are trying to do the right thing. So I have learned that I'm really picky about who my bosses are. And I go to work every day knowing that everyone on my team is trying to do the right thing, and is trying to make the world, their little piece of the world, a little bit of a better place. So even if the impact is small, you just have to know that you're working towards something that's going to be good in the long run. And so from an outsider looking in at politics, I think if you take a deep breath and realize that there's very few things that are black and white, and there's very few things that are life and death, and there's very few things that are as big of a deal as our current climate likes to make them seem, then you can pick through what's right and what's wrong a little bit better and work towards what you think is best.
Well, and Katie, you've accomplished so much despite having only graduated last year, even though you point out it was a rather unprecedented way to graduate. But can you describe the experiences that you've had? I mean, you've had several experiences within politics and worked your way toward campaigning, as you pointed out in your presentation. Are there particular skills that you feel like you picked up along the way that were particularly useful or helped prepare you for the role of campaigning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I never set out to be a campaign professional, right? Like that was not the end all goal when I was thinking about anything that I wanted to do. And I still think that I might want to go to law school or change career path or do something different. But what I've learned is that you take the skills that you have and you take the connections that you have and you build on them to the best that you can. My first internship was a little bit of serendipity. I don't think that anyone at the IOGP really thought I was qualified for what they were sending me out to do. But it taught me the skill set that I needed that 5 internships later, the Cox campaign was looking for. And they needed someone who knew how to fundraise, and I knew how to fundraise, and I was able to come back to Utah from DC and to do that for them. And so it all worked out. I was introduced to Spencer's campaign manager by one of the people that I had worked with on a previous internship and ended up interning for. So it's little connections and little pieces that build along the way. And I think that especially when you get into political fields, this is a question that I asked Neil I remember asking Neil Abercrombie as a student is when do you know when the next time to make your next move is? Like, when do you know to move on? When do you know to start looking for new opportunities? And for the most part, there's no real answer to that except for to have a good team around you, who push you to be better, who don't let you become stagnant, who are really really invested in who you are. So as my rule of thumb, I'm really picky about who my bosses are, and I'm really picky about who I work for. And that has served me really well because there's always someone who's more interested in my next step than even I am at some point. So
Great, thanks. So what would you say, what do you think, what did you find to be like the most stressful parts or the most difficult parts of working with the campaign? And then also, what do you think were the most exciting aspects of it?
good question. So I, on the campaign, I frequently worked 20-hour days every day of the week, and it was really fun. And I think that the most stressful parts of it were the out of control elements. And obviously, you can count the global pandemic as an out of control element. And to some extent, everyone has to deal with things like that on a day to day basis in 2020 and 2021. But um, in an era where people will believe just about anything that they see online, it was really stressful as a campaign professional to have people share mistruths about my candidate or about things that I believed on the internet, and to bandwagon across who knows what, and all of a sudden Spencer Cox is eating babies and I don't know what happened on Facebook or where or what I should have done about it. So some things like that are really out of your control are stressful. So I just had to create a new mantra for myself with regards to that stress, that reasonable people win out. And that's what I've decided, is that you just have to say reasonable people win out and you do your best, and then you leave the rest. Um, the most exciting was by far having our governor connect with people, and I was really lucky to follow him around quite frequently. And we did a forum at Utah State where a student came up to him afterwards. The governor had talked about education funding and the importance of investing in our teachers. And a kid came up and said that he appreciated that other candidates had come, but that he really felt like Governor Cox understood him, and it made him feel good about his choice to become a teacher, and that he was more excited to become a teacher. And by far, we shouldn't have politicians be our number one role models. Politics should not be our end all be all. But it's moments like that where you really feel like what you're doing is impactful, and that the person that I was supporting was going to have an impact to make the world a little bit better. So that was probably the most exciting part, was seeing those little connection pieces.
Katie, you've talked about the importance of having a good team. And I do, find you to be an incredibly modest person for all that you've achieved. But if you turn the lens toward yourself for a moment, are there attributes you feel you had or that you feel one should have to succeed in a political or a campaigning environment? And is there advice you might share with current students who are interested in this kind of work?
Yeah, that's a good question too. And I think that my number one advice is really easy, and it's get to work. It's not, I don't need a degree to do the job that I was doing. I had the same job before and after I graduated. But what I did need to do was to get my hands dirty and get going and get working. There's always stuff to do, and it needs to get done. And I think that at some point I don't know when it was, but at some point I think that we all kind of developed this idea that there's some work that's worthwhile and there's some work that's intern work, or there's some work that's just random tasks that people are assigning you because they don't trust you with something bigger. But definitely a really significant part of campaigns, and something that I'm lucky I learned quickly, is that there's no such thing as intern work. And I sat in my office all day long and did my fundraising and did everything that I could to make sure that the campaign was financially stable. And then after that, I went and gathered signatures, or I went out and delivered yard signs. And our campaign manager did the same, and sometimes Spencer and Abby Cox did the same. And if you have an idea that there's work that you're willing to do and work that you're not willing to do, then you're not going to get as far. There's always more work to be done. It's not like in business where there's a list of check marks to be checked and then you're done for the day. In a campaign, you can always do more. You can always reach more people. And so my interns did as much as I could trust them to do. Interns who I trusted to do the same work that I was doing got to do it with me. The more that we could get done, the better. And having people who are willing to just get their hands dirty and do the work, not worrying about who gets credit, are always more successful, especially in a field that moves really, really quickly like the campaign.
So, Katie, obviously campaigns eventually end. And so with that, you've got a lot of, looking at your colleagues and everything, what types of jobs and careers have you seen other people do after a campaign wraps up? And as well, how's this transition been for you?
Good question. So obviously this question could look really different if my candidate didn't win. And so I might even talk a little bit about where some other people that I knew who were working on other campaigns ended up too. But even though my candidate did win, I still did all of the normal things that you do when you're in politics and you're looking for your next job. And after I knew that the campaign was going to end, I reached out to my network and I said, hey, like, what's going on? What is everyone doing? Who needs help? And is there a role that might be good for me? And people are always willing to help, especially when they know that there's a campaign involved. It makes it kind of easy. But we had a really small team. Some of us ended up working for, one person went back to a university and started working there. A couple of us ended up in the governor's office. A couple of us ended up doing more consulting, lobbying type of things. So there's a variety of things that you can do for a next step from a campaign. My biggest project was that they asked me to help with the inauguration and the transition a little bit. So I spent a lot of time doing that. But really what it is you pick your you pick your network and you ask to see who needs help with what. We've been working really hard to connect people that we met on the campaign with good opportunities and jobs moving forward. And we have people who are ready to go back to school, or moms who are ready to re-enter the workforce or anything like that. So they're all doing what we're all doing, and we help each other find good spots. I had a couple of different options of things to do because of people that I met on the campaign, or even people that I met in DC and who watched what happened with my campaign and were interested in whether or not I wanted to come back to DC. So really it's not much different than other fields, except for in politics, obviously it happens a lot faster and it has harsher end dates, which can make it a little bit scary, but it's a good opportunity to increase that network that's going to help you at the end of it.
Perfect. So now, thank you so much, Katie, for everything that you've shared so far. And it looks like we've got a bunch of questions coming in from our viewers today. And so I'm just going to get started by asking one of those. So did you feel qualified when you first went to intern in DC after your freshman year? Or, this person's wondering, how did you decide and get selected for the internship?
That's a great question. And I definitely did not feel qualified, nor was I qualified. And the IOGP essentially told me that they were like, you're a little young for this, but they let me interview anyway. And that's how the IOGP works, is that you fill out an application, and it's pretty thorough, but you can find it on their website, and they happen every once in a while. I think that summer ones are usually due in February. But you just fill it out, you mark a little bit of interest, then the IOGP works to connect you with internships that might be a good fit. So I ended up with 2 different interviews for internships, and one interview went really, really well, and I liked the girl that interviewed me, and she was really engaging, and she was interested in me and what was going on. And the other one seemed like I was going to be they weren't quite as interested in having an intern at all, it felt like. So I chose one, and I went out to DC, and I was not really qualified, except for I was ready to learn and I was ready to do the work. So I ended up helping them make calls, and I learned how to have a really good fundraising phone voice, and I walked the hour to work every day, and it was a really good experience. But it didn't matter that I wasn't qualified to begin with, because I knew how to write and I knew how to speak and I knew how to think, and they could teach me the rest. And they were really patient with me in order to do that. And I'm still really well connected with all of them now, and they're still really excellent mentors for me, and they're the first people that I call if I ever get stuck on a project. So it's nice to have a team that's willing to work with you like that. But I think that even if you don't, as an intern, right, like there's very few internships where anyone expects you to be qualified. So as long as you're willing to understand what you don't know and to put in the work to get to where you need to be, then you'll be just fine.
Perfect. While we're on the topic of your DC internships, you know, I have a couple other questions here, more specifically about that. One of them is, what pieces of advice would you give to a future intern on Capitol Hill? This can be either about the work or living there in general.
Yeah, that's a good question too. So I, the only Capitol Hill that I've really technically worked on is in Salt Lake. And the Salt Lake Capitol is a really fun place to be. The Utah legislature is particularly interactive, and it's particularly transparent. They win awards for their transparency frequently. The legislators themselves are extremely accessible, which doesn't happen very frequently in other states. But if you want to do that Salt Lake internship, you should definitely talk to the IOGP about it. It's a really unique experience that I've never seen anywhere else, and it's amazing. But the legislators don't have any staff except for you. And so you help them with their constituent outreach, and you help them draft their bills, and you help make sure their bills get through committee, and you help make sure they have their favorite drinks on the floor of the Senate, and whatever it is, you're in charge of doing. And it's a really good kind of 45-day deep dive into how that works. And it's really fun. My experience on the Hill in Washington, D.C., I didn't work in anyone's official office, so I've never worked in the Capitol. But I worked for a political entity one of my last years in DC that is on Capitol Hill, just behind the Capitol. And so it was really fun to see. It was an office where we had members of the executive branch and members of Congress coming in and out all the time. So I would see people, and they would hold webinars where they had people come and talk to us. And it was a really fun experience to kind of be in the middle of it. But that's what I'd say about it, is that if you're going to do an internship where you kind of end up being in the middle of everything going on, then you just kind of have to embrace it. And it can seem crazy and that everyone knows what's going on except for you, but chances are that they don't. And if they do, then they're willing to share with you. So you just kind of have to embrace it and try your best to keep up and chase whoever you're supposed to chase as fast as you can.
So how long did you end up staying in DC during your internships?
I was usually in DC from right after either the legislature ended in March or right after school ended in May, depending on what I had been doing that spring semester, until about August or September, depending on what I had going on at school. I had one semester where I pretty frequently kind of traveled all over the place to make stuff happen, and sometimes I would go back to DC during the semester or work remotely from DC. So it just kind of depends. I've done a semester in Salt Lake where I was taking classes at Utah State and Logan still, and so would drive pretty frequently, or I would take the class at one of the extensions in Kaysville. So there's lots of ways to make it happen, but in general, I was in DC just for the summer.
So now I've got a question for you, circling back to campaigns. So being in a campaign seems like you'd have to learn how to be decisive. How would you recommend being better at making decisions with confidence?
That's a good question. And I don't know that I ever really needed to be that decisive, because I always had a team to bounce an idea off of. So sometimes it was a constituent calls and they have a question, and you win their vote or you don't. So you don't really have time to process beforehand, but you can certainly do a deep dive with your team afterwards. But for the most part, my job is to execute what my candidate wants executed. And so it's an interesting way to do it. And some candidates are more hands-on than others, and some candidates have more of a preference as to how things get done than others. But for the most part, your instinct is probably right. And if you need to call someone who's in the right demographic of whatever decision you're trying to make to get it figured out, then do that too. But for the most part, you just kind of have to trust your gut and trust yourself that what you're thinking is probably right. And if it's not, then you'll figure that out next.
Nice, perfect. Okay, so another one of our viewers says, what the heck is anticipatory intelligence? And did studying it help you at all?
This is a really high stakes question because I'm sure that Dr. Johnson is still on this call and I have not memorized Brianna Bowen's talking points. But anticipatory intelligence is Dr. Johnson and Matt Barrett and Brianna Bowen's project that has turned into a really amazing program where they teach an interdisciplinary set of courses aimed at tackling the next biggest problems that our country is going to face. So sometimes it was tackling what potential challenges existed with AI and how you might end up dealing with that situation. My research focused a lot on election security and how we were going to handle it if someone started to discount the credibility of our election system, which ended up kind of playing out in 2020, which was really interesting. But that's what it is it's taking our best research on the next set of challenges that we're going to face and how to tackle them. And it's sometimes from an intelligence perspective, but uses the entire national security framework. So obviously all of those different actors have different pieces of how they handle it. I, in my role, have worked with our state threat assessors to handle some of these problems, and it's always kind of interesting to see it from that side of things, just to kind of see how you really do in real time use intelligence that's coming in from a source tied with everything that you think might happen in the future, and then to make a plan for how you become more resilient, to make your event more resilient, to make the governor more resilient, or whatever it might be. So kind of an interdisciplinary crash course in all things solving problems. And we'll see how mad Brianna Bowen is at that answer.
To me, it sounded great, but so the next question here, as an insider, what do you think is the most important popular misconceptions about politics?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I think that the number one thing that drives me crazy is people will cite something that they saw on the news, but they'll cite a headline, and they'll say, guess what happened? President Biden said that we're going to blah, blah, blah. And what really happened is that President Biden had a meeting about something with someone, or he signed an executive order that was half that potent, or whatever it happens to be. But they take the headlines and they take that kind of sensationalized piece of what's going on, and then they apply it really broadly. The better practice is to assume that nothing is as exciting as it seems, and to take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. Everyone deserves more benefit of the doubt than we give them in 2021. So just taking a deep breath is kind of the biggest thing that I think people don't realize when they're thinking about politics, because when you, in how we present our culture, and how we present culture about everything in 2021, but especially about politics, everything seems like a really, really big life or death deal. And for the most part, there's always room to take a breath and to give people more space to be trying their best and making mistakes along the way. So there's definitely cases where we need to hold people accountable, right? There's always cases where people really don't care for the best interest, or really don't understand what's going on. And there's always room for us to be on the right side and to fix things and to help people along where we can. But a little bit of grace while we do that is always helpful.
So Katie, do you have any advice for political science students that you have learned from your own undergraduate political science experience and experience in Washington and then working for Governor Cox?
Yes, and my advice is to seriously take every opportunity to learn. And I moved very, very quickly through my undergraduate career, not in the sense that I finished faster than anyone else, but I was just always moving quickly and running from one thing to the next. And I'm really, really glad that I did that because I got to learn a lot of different pieces. And it's been really important to my career, and it's really important. I think that at some point in time, I could have chosen an academic political science track and forgotten about all the other things that I liked to learn and experience. And that wouldn't have served me as well as my eventual education did. I think that Andrea read my bio, but I have a minor in art history. And I spent a lot of time learning about how to curate galleries and how to create a storyline for an exhibit and how to kind of experience art in a variety of different ways and to understand it. And that was just as key to my education, and it's just as key to what I do on a daily basis as anything I learned in political science was. So take every opportunity to learn. Doesn't matter what form it's in. It doesn't matter if it seems like less of a big deal than something else that you're doing. If you like it, then it's worth it. So that's one piece of advice, and especially for political science students who tend to move quickly like I did. And then my experience in Washington, I think that my advice is to be kind to everyone because you never know where people will end up. And there's people to this day that have said mean things to me and now need things from me, and I remember them for bad reasons. And it doesn't always mean that I'm going to say no to whatever they need, right? Like it doesn't mean that I'm going to be mean about it, but there's always people who are surprised that I know them and that I know them from when I was an intern. So that's my advice, is just to make sure that you always remember that everyone around you has the potential to do something next. And that next thing might be something that you're interested in helping them with. That next thing might be something that you need their help with. That next thing might be the thing that decides whether or not your program has funding. It might be the person that whispers in a senator's ear about whether or not to vote for an appropriation. So whatever it is, it's always good to be kind to everyone in general, but definitely if you work in politics and you're surrounded by people who have a lot of next steps in front of them. And then for Governor Cox, my number one thing that I've learned is that nothing matters if you do it the wrong way. And that if you get to wherever you wanted to be by doing it the wrong way, then it probably wasn't worth it to get there in the end. And he's a really great example of that. And he's an incredibly kind and gracious person who seeks to get proximate with problems that he doesn't understand. And that's definitely been my biggest thing that I've learned from him, is that I can get a little cutthroat and I want to win, and I like winning a lot, and I don't really care who gets in my way if I want to win. But sometimes it's important to take a step back and to realize that other people are also humans and not just things to win against. so that's the advice that I've learned from him, is that in politics, especially as a political science, there's always going to be wins and losses, and everything that you do is going to be framed in a win or framed in a loss. But there's room for you to make the margins of that a little bit blurrier, and you probably should.
It seems like you've learned a lot about relationships, and you have a lot of good advice about talking to other people and caring about other people. And so this question is about networking. Do you have any tips or recommendations on how to start building a network, or where would you say the network of people you knew really began?
That's a great question too. And I've heard a million networking tips over the course of my college career, and I don't really think that I'm that good at it. But what I have learned to be good at is to just start conversations, and I've really had to work on that skill, but I've gotten a little bit better. Just because of the kind of internships that I did and because of the kind of jobs that I've had, I very frequently end up in rooms with people who have better networks than I do. So frequently I'm following around a senator or a governor or whoever my boss is at the moment at a party. And it's kind of intimidating to be in a situation like that, right? Because you're there to staff someone else, and you're not really supposed to be there to network. But people notice who's in a situation, and obviously this doesn't really apply in a pandemic at all. But they know who you are because you're with someone else. So back to my being really picky about who your boss is. If you can find a mentor who's willing to let you play tag along and who's willing to make introductions for you and who's willing to let you wander off on your own and start a conversation about election security at a party, if you're willing to find someone who's willing to say, oh, I know that you're interested in art, or you just bought a new piece. Katie was actually an art history major, or anything like that, that can just kind of help you to start making those connections. That's my advice for starting to network. And then from there, my number one piece of networking advice, if you just have to do something out of the blue, is to ask questions. And people are always, always, always happy to talk about what they care about. Legislators are happy to talk about their bills if you pay them a compliment and ask them a sincere question about what they're trying to do. And researchers are happy to talk about the research that they're doing. Businessmen are happy to talk about their latest product, and there's a million things that you can learn from people that they're happy to tell you. But you just have to be willing to kind of make that initial ask, and it's tricky, but it's usually worth it. And the worst thing that can happen is that they don't respond to your email, or that they don't respond to your text, or that you have to walk away at a party and go get a different snack because it got a little awkward. So whatever it is, your worst case scenario probably isn't that bad when it comes to networking. And so it's always worth it to make that initial outreach.
Thank you for that advice. The next question that we have here says, as a professor and a major advisor, I often have to justify the benefits of a social sciences and humanities degree, despite so many employers citing the benefits of various soft skills. So from your experience, can you think of something that I can tell them, like a positive soundbite or like a bumper sticker phrase? How can I advertise the importance of a social sciences and humanities degree?
That's a really good question too. I think that what it is that I know how to think. And I don't have a lot of technical questions. And right now I'm starting a job where I work with a lot of people who have economics degrees and statistics degrees. And I really have a hard time keeping up with them sometimes. And it sounds like they're speaking Chinese to me very frequently. But I know how to think about the problem. So if someone can take 2 seconds to explain the math to me, or to skip past the math and explain everything else to me, then I can figure it out. And that's what my social science degree taught me, is how to think. And as a bonus, I learned how to write and how to read, and thanks to Dr. Johnson's friends in the Air Force, I know how to speed read even, and so I can process information and I can think. I think that's probably, especially as a professor, if you're talking to someone who's trying to decide between a statistics degree or trying to decide on a political science degree or whatever, or an art history minor versus a statistics minor or an economics minor. I know how to think, and I know how to think in different ways, and I know how other people like to think. And that's what's been helpful to me.
I love that. It's so great to see how you've applied all the various different skills that you learned. So we all have to start somewhere. What advice would you give a freshman just starting out at Utah State?
That's an awesome question. And my advice is to be involved in everything. I got really, really, really lucky that when I decided to go to Utah State, I was connected with some alumni who were really interested in making sure that I got connected. It actually happened, I knew them before this, but we actually ended up at an alumni dinner. And I don't know if they still do these for freshmen, but it was before school even started. It was during the summer. They lived in a neighborhood close to mine. And so I went to go visit them, and there were some other students there. And I told one girl that I was interested in maybe going to law school. And she said, oh, I'm involved in the Government Relations Council, and we'd love to have you apply. And so she helped me get connected with an application. And I was on the Government Relations Council that first year that I was a student. And it was really fun, and I learned a lot of things, and that's kind of how I got connected with some of the people that helped me find internships next. But it was really fun. And Logan's a hard place to be if you're not super connected sometimes, and especially coming from a bigger city. I mean, I was from Salt Lake, so it's not like I was coming from a massive metropolitan area, but Logan still felt really small to me. But I was involved so much and on campus so much that I didn't really notice, and I grew to really love Logan because of the people that I knew there. So that's definitely my advice, is that everything is easier if you keep yourself involved and you keep yourself engaged.
Now, the last question I have for you today is, do you have any advice on self-care if you are in a stressful job situation?
I'm a really terrible example of this. But I I think that my biggest piece of advice is whatever you need to do, you have to do. Um, so for example, I drink a lot of Diet Coke, and I don't think it's even for the caffeine. I just like it. And it makes me really happy. And so I drink it a lot. And I like eating cookies, so I eat a lot of cookies. And I balance that out by eating broccoli sometimes. But whatever it is that you need to do, you just have to do. And that applies for your poor food choices, but it also applies to kind of setting boundaries for yourself. And if there's something that you really can't do, or if you really do need to go home and just take a shower and go to bed, then you have to do that. So take the space for yourself that you need, and make sure that you're surrounding yourself with people who remind you to take that space for yourself, and who help you to take that space for yourself, and help you have the breaks that you need. um, and you just can't be afraid to, if you have to schedule it, then do. But just don't be afraid to kind of take the time to make sure that you're okay first. um, and then whatever makes you happy in the middle of that, do it. I ended up watching a lot of Grey's Anatomy during the campaign at like 2 a.m. when I would get home, and I'd watch it for 5 minutes and then turn it off and go to bed. And I don't know why that was helpful to me, but it was. And I don't even really like doctors that much, but Grey's Anatomy is what made me feel better. So whatever, I think it was just their problems were more stressful than mine. But whatever it is, do it. And if it's not working, then stop and figure something else out. And if you've surrounded yourself with people who care about you, then they'll help you figure out a next step. So reach out.
All right. Well, thank you, Katie, so much. And thank you for everyone else for so many great questions. And also thanks to London for being able to make our jobs look a whole lot easier by managing all those questions. Katie, you gave us a lot of great advice, and especially with the networking. And I've been there too, where you're networking and sometimes you just got to move away from the snack table to go to someone else because it's a little bit awkward. But and giving us all that insight on the campaign world as well as the political world in general. So much great information. I hope you guys who are watching this have be able to take some great notes. I know I did. So again, thanks for spending some time with us today, Katie, and everyone else who's been watching.
Thanks for having me.
And I would echo those sentiments. Katie, it's been amazing to see what you've accomplished, without a year of being out of college yet under your belt. So I can't wait to see what the future holds for you. And if we're still doing this 10 or 15 years from now, I hope we can have you back and see where you've taken this experience and where it's taken you. And we wish you the best of luck in your new role with the Office of Management and Budget. We hope you'll stay in touch and let us know what's going on with that. And Katie is a great resource. So we hope that students listening today will think about connecting with Katie and following up, because our alumni, as Katie demonstrated with that story about, that connection she was able to make as a freshman, it's never too early or too late to make a connection with a fellow CHaSS alum. So they're a great resource, and we hope that you will keep Katie in mind. Speaking of alumni, I want to tell you about some upcoming events in this series. So on February 18th, we'll be talking to two of our alums who currently work in New York City, and both of them work in sort of nonlinear paths as far as what they graduated with and where it took them. So they had to strike out on their own to start down a new career, but they also did it in a city that a lot of people would find challenging. So we'll be focusing on what it's like to make it and to live in New York City on February 18th at 11 a.m. And then on March 4th, we'll be talking to a member of the Foreign Service, Dan Canigan, who is another one of our alumni, about his life in the Foreign Service. And because he is in the Foreign Service, that will be held a little earlier in the day because he's on a different time zone. So that will be at 9 a.m. on March 4th. And again, you can find all of our programming on the Alumni Lunch Series webpage, and you can watch recordings of anything you've missed. So please stay tuned for additional events this spring and go back and see what you may not have been able to make it to. And I would just like to thank everyone. As Joe said, we'd like to thank Katie Miner again for giving us such great advice and spending time with us today. I'd like to thank my co-host, Joe in London, and I'd like to thank our audience for taking the time to come and ask such thoughtful questions of Katie. So thank you. We hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks. And I wish everyone a wonderful and safe rest of their day. Thanks, everyone.